She was left for a younger woman, but when she made a bold move in court, he was trembling in fear. The morning sun poured through the wide bay windows of the Harper residence, casting a golden glow over the polished marble floors and pristine white furniture. Eleanor Harper stood in the kitchen, carefully arranging fruit on a porcelain platter while the smell of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the air. From the outside, everything appeared idyllic. Her husband David was a successful financial consultant, and their suburban home was the epitome of comfort and stability. Eleanor had left her career in architecture a decade ago to support his rising ambitions and focus on building a peaceful home. In return, David often praised her loyalty, her grace, her unwavering dedication. But lately, something had changed in the tone of his voice. David had started coming home later, brushing off Eleanor's questions with vague excuses about client dinners or last-minute meetings. The warmth that once lingered in his smile had turned mechanical, and his touch had become colder, more distant. Eleanor tried to ignore the sinking feeling that lodged itself deeper in her chest each day. After all, marriages went through phases, didn't they? But even as she stirred his coffee and left it on the granite counter each morning like she always did, she began to notice the untouched mugs piling in the sink. She told herself not to jump to conclusions, not to spiral. Yet, a small, growing part of her began to dread what she might already know in her heart. It was during a quiet Sunday dinner that the silence between them became unbearable. Eleanor had made roasted chicken with rosemary, David's favorite dish, and poured him a glass of his usual Bordeaux. As he took a seat, he barely glanced at her, his eyes glued to the screen of his phone, fingers typing with mechanical urgency. She sat across from him, waiting for him to speak, to acknowledge her presence, but all she got was a mumbled, "Thanks." The clinking of cutlery filled the air in place of conversation, and Eleanor's appetite slowly faded. Her gaze drifted to the man she had loved for nearly 15 years, wondering when he had started to feel like a stranger at the table. Later that night, she caught a glimpse of his phone lighting up on the nightstand while he was in the shower. A message preview glowed on the screen. "Last night was amazing. I can't wait to see you again." Her hands trembled as she quickly turned it over, heart thundering against her ribs. She didn't want to see the name. Not yet. Not until she was ready to face the truth that was now clawing at her from the shadows. David returned moments later, toweling his hair, humming a tune she didn't recognize. Eleanor lay in bed beside him, facing the opposite wall, eyes wide open in the dark, the weight of unspoken betrayal pressing on her chest like a stone. Eleanor's birthday had always been a quiet but meaningful occasion. She never needed parties or grand gestures, just a dinner, a thoughtful note, a moment of connection. That year, she had set the table with candles and a homemade lemon tart cooling in the kitchen, the scent filling the room with a nostalgic warmth. She wore a soft green dress David had once complimented, trying to feel hopeful despite everything. But hours passed, and David still hadn't come home. She called once, no answer. Sent a message, no reply. By 9 p.m., the candles had melted halfway down, the tart sat untouched, and Eleanor sat on the edge of the couch, wrapped in silence. At 11:47 p.m., David finally walked in, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and red wine. His tie was loosened, and there was a trace of lipstick smudged near his collarbone. "Oh, was today your birthday?" he asked, not even pretending to sound sorry. Eleanor felt her throat tighten, the room spinning slightly. She looked at him for a long moment, searching for any trace of the man she used to know. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged, poured himself a drink, and walked past her without answering. That night, Eleanor sat alone at the dining table, staring at the flickering candle until it finally went out. The next morning, Eleanor found the evidence she didn't want but couldn't ignore anymore. A red lipstick tube had rolled out from under the passenger seat of David's car as she searched for her missing scarf. She picked it up with a trembling hand, reading the label, Scarlet Seduction. It wasn't hers. It had never been hers. Inside, her world tilted on its axis. The room, the air, everything suddenly felt too still. A week later, she opened the closet to find David's clothes missing, his favorite jackets, the designer shoes she had gifted him years ago. There was no note, no explanation. Just absence. When David finally returned a few days later, it wasn't to apologize, it was to announce. "I'm moving out," he said coldly, without eye contact. "I've met someone. We're serious." Eleanor didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, absorbing the words like a wall absorbs bullets. "She's younger," he added, almost smugly, "and she actually listens. You've become dull." That was the first time Eleanor felt the real sting of humiliation, being discarded, not because of some catastrophic mistake, but simply because she wasn't exciting enough anymore. She had been loyal, supportive, devoted, and apparently, forgettable. The following week, Eleanor invited David over under the pretense of discussing logistics, the mortgage, the assets, what would happen next. He arrived late, again, dressed casually, as if the disintegration of a decade-long marriage required no effort. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, holding a list of shared accounts, medical bills, household items. But as he scrolled through his phone while she spoke, barely listening, she finally snapped. "Was it all just convenience for you?" she asked suddenly. "Was I just a placeholder until something better came along?" He looked up, bored. "Don't be dramatic, Eleanor. You're acting like I betrayed you. People grow apart." His words sliced deeper than any shouting match ever could. "She's 28, David. She still says like every 3 words and orders frappuccinos with sprinkles. You left your wife for a walking Instagram caption." That made him pause, but only briefly. "At least she makes me feel alive," he muttered. Eleanor stood up slowly, her hands clenched at her sides, jaw tight. "Get out," she said quietly. "Take your things, your excuses, and your new life, and get out." He did. Without looking back. And as the door closed behind him, Eleanor felt the tears coming, not because he was gone, but because she had stayed too long with someone who had left her heart long ago. Eleanor didn't watch him pack. She sat upstairs, motionless in the bedroom they once shared, while David moved in and out of the guest room, collecting his shirts, his watches, the cufflinks she gave him on their 5th anniversary. Each closing drawer felt like a quiet farewell, heavy but indifferent. He didn't say a word, no goodbye, no apology, not even a final glance toward her. When she heard the front door click shut, it was like a vacuum of silence sucked the air out of the house. Only the ticking of the hallway clock reminded her time was still moving. Later, she came downstairs to find a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the counter and a small yellow post-it stuck to the fridge. "Didn't take the coffee machine." "You can keep it." Eleanor stared at the note for a long time, feeling both insulted and absurdly heartbroken. Of everything they had built, from vacations to wedding vows to shared furniture, he left her with caffeine and pity. That night, she sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee she couldn't taste. As the reality settled, he was gone, and the emptiness was louder than his absence had ever been. The following weeks unraveled slowly, painfully, as if each day were a reminder of how much her life had shifted. Eleanor kept making dinner, out of habit more than hunger. At first, she would set 2 plates on the table before remembering only one was needed now. Eventually, she stopped setting any at all and ate standing up in silence. The lemon tart she had once perfected for David's birthday hardened in the fridge untouched. Cooking, which used to bring her comfort, now felt hollow, like rehearsing a scene for an audience that had long exited the theater. The worst moments were in the early evenings, just after the sun dipped below the horizon. The golden glow that once filled their home now cast long, lonely shadows. She'd sit on the living room couch with a book in her lap, but her eyes rarely moved across the pages. Memories clung to every corner, his laughter in the hallway, their old arguments by the fireplace, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the blanket. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was brutal. Eleanor often found herself staring at the wall, wondering how a home so full of life could become so unbearably still. At first, people in the neighborhood offered kind smiles, the kind reserved for those recently widowed or quietly suffering. Eleanor appreciated the subtle gestures, an extra casserole on her porch, a brief touch on her arm during a walk, but they didn't last long. Soon, the pity turned into curiosity. Whispers traveled from porch to porch like wildfire. He left her for someone barely out of college, she overheard once at the local bakery. Apparently, she's some yoga instructor, said another. Eleanor kept her head high, but inside, she wilted under the weight of their gazes. She could feel it even in the grocery store. Strangers who used to wave now avoided her eyes. A former friend, Carolyn, had once invited her to every book club meeting, but now pretended not to notice her at the produce aisle. Eleanor realized something uncomfortable: people weren't sure how to act around a discarded woman. Divorce wasn't just a private pain, it became a public label, and suddenly she was the woman he left, not Eleanor, not a person with history, kindness, and quiet strength. Each interaction chipped away at her pride, until she started timing her errands to avoid crowds altogether. One morning, as she tried to pay for her groceries, Eleanor's card was declined. Embarrassed, she assumed it was a banking error. But when she checked her account later, a sense of dread bloomed in her chest. Several joint funds had been emptied or transferred, savings, investment portfolios, and even their travel fund were gone. She contacted the bank, only to be told that changes had been made under David's name, since the accounts were registered with him as primary holder. Her hands trembled as she hung up, the phone slipping from her fingers like a dead weight. That evening, Eleanor sat on the floor of her study, surrounded by financial papers, tax records, and bank statements, all suddenly foreign. The man who had once held her hand in courtship had now emptied their shared future without warning. She realized the betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was financial warfare. She had no access to their assets, no income of her own, and a mortgage still pending. David hadn't just left her, he had ensured her vulnerability. It was no longer about heartbreak. It was survival now. And survival meant she would need to fight, smartly, quietly, and without mercy. The envelope came on a rainy afternoon, thick, beige, official. The courier didn't meet her eyes as he handed it over, just muttered signature here, and left. Eleanor stood by the door, staring at the envelope like it was ticking. With slow fingers, she opened it and unfolded the neatly printed pages. David was filing for divorce. The words were cold and precise. Division of assets, minimal. Spousal support, none. Custody concerns, not applicable. He had reduced their marriage to a legal transaction, and he wasn't even offering decency in the bargain. Tucked inside was a personal note, handwritten in David's rigid script. "Let's make this quick and painless," it read. Eleanor stood frozen, paper in hand, thunder rolling faintly in the distance. Quick and painless, for him. For her, nothing about this had been painless. She had been humiliated, abandoned, and now legally discarded. But something within her shifted in that moment. The woman David thought he could silence with betrayal was still standing, and she was done being quiet. Eleanor walked to her desk, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and began planning her response, not just legally, but strategically. The storm had begun. The courtroom was sterile, cold in its neutrality, but Eleanor felt every eye on her as she stepped inside. David was already seated with his lawyer, a young, sharp-suited man who looked more like someone fresh out of a business school than a seasoned attorney. At David's side sat a woman half Eleanor's age, flawlessly dressed in a sleeveless pastel blouse despite the weather, chewing on gum like she belonged there. Eleanor tightened her coat and clutched her folder of documents, her hands clammy despite her composed expression. This was the moment she dreaded, the formal severing of everything she once believed was permanent. As the judge called their case, David leaned over to whisper something in the young woman's ear. She giggled and glanced at Eleanor with a thin smile that barely hid her mockery. The lawyer began with sterile precision, referring to Eleanor as the dependent party, his voice devoid of empathy. Eleanor remained quiet, observing the way her life was being dissected into property lines and line items. But the worst sting wasn't the lawyer's words or the cold procedure, it was David's smirk every time something was said about what she no longer contributed. He looked like a man already celebrating a victory. During a recess, Eleanor stepped into the corridor, needing a moment to breathe. The young woman followed shortly after, leaning beside her with exaggerated casualness. "You look worn out," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "David told me you used to be an architect." "That's adorable." Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Her hands were clenched inside her coat pockets, nails digging into her palms. "He said you were sweet once, but a bit dull for his pace. I guess some women just let themselves go after marriage." The words were delivered like a slap, meant to provoke. Eleanor turned her head slowly, meeting the young woman's eyes. "If your worth is only measured by how long you can hold a man's attention, I sincerely hope your timer isn't running out." The woman blinked, momentarily caught off guard by Eleanor's composure. She flipped her hair with a scoff and walked away, but the encounter left Eleanor shaken. Not because the words hurt, but because they forced her to look at herself clearly. Had she lost herself trying to be someone's wife? Had she dimmed her own light to make someone else shine? That night, she stood before her mirror and truly studied her reflection for the first time in years. When the day's session ended, Eleanor stepped into the elevator alone, her heels echoing in the narrow hallway. As the metal doors slid shut, her face finally cracked. The tight control she held in court broke, and tears streamed silently down her cheeks. She didn't sob or shake, just stood there, tears falling freely, her jaw set in quiet resolve. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirrored panel, the same eyes but with a different fire beginning to flicker behind them. She realized no one was coming to rescue her, no miracle was about to land in her lap. The only way out of this was through it. Back in her car, she sat in the parking lot, engine off, staring at the steering wheel. She remembered a time when her life felt full, when sketchpads and models filled her days, when her opinions mattered in design meetings. That woman still existed somewhere, buried beneath years of compromise and quiet sacrifice. She pulled out her phone and searched through her old email archive until she found a name, Professor Helen Andrews, her mentor from architecture school. With trembling fingers, she began typing a message, not entirely sure what she would say, but desperate to speak to someone who once saw her as more than someone's wife. Days passed without a reply, and Eleanor almost convinced herself the message had been foolish. But then, one evening, her inbox lit up. Helen had responded. The message was warm, direct, and filled with surprise. "Eleanor, I always wondered what happened to you. You were one of the most gifted designers I ever taught. Let's talk soon. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, reading the message over and over, as if it might vanish. Something stirred inside her, an old pulse, a rhythm she had long forgotten. She retrieved a dusty sketchbook from the back of a cabinet and turned its pages slowly, recognizing the passion she had once poured into every line. She sharpened a pencil and stared at the blank page for several minutes. Then, cautiously at first, she began to draw. Shapes emerged, lines connected, and slowly a structure began to take form. She hadn't lost the skill. It had only gone dormant, waiting for her to remember who she was. The next day, she visited a nearby bookstore and bought updated architecture magazines, blueprints, and design tools. She stayed up until dawn sketching ideas, fueled not by rage or sorrow, but by rediscovery. The humiliation had broken something in her, yes, but now something stronger was growing in its place. That weekend, Eleanor and Helen spoke by video call. Her former professor, now retired but consulting, was thrilled to see her. "You still have that spark, I can see it in your eyes," she said. Eleanor shared her sketches, embarrassed at first, but Helen praised her instinct and balance. "You never lost it. You just needed to remember." The call ended with an unexpected offer. A friend of Helen's was looking for help on a community housing project. "It's small, not paid much, but it's a start," Helen said. Eleanor accepted without hesitation. That evening, she printed out her resume, something she hadn't done in over a decade. There was something grounding about preparing for work again. Eleanor cleaned out the guest room and turned it into a studio space. The table was cluttered with sketches and sample materials, but it felt alive. She began waking up early again, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The days still felt heavy at times, the legal battle still loomed large, but now she had a thread to hold on to. A purpose. She wasn't just the woman who got left, she was the woman who had once been brilliant. And now, she was ready to remind the world of that. The community housing project wasn't glamorous, but it was exactly what Eleanor needed. The team was small, the budget tight, and the deadlines unforgiving, but she thrived. For the first time in years, her ideas were met with interest. Her sketches guided real-world improvements, and the team leaned on her experience. She found herself working late into the evening, not from obligation, but joy. The satisfaction of seeing a blueprint transform into a plan was better than therapy. Each passing day distanced her from the courtroom and drew her closer to the version of herself she had nearly forgotten. Though the work didn't pay much, the impact on Eleanor's confidence was invaluable. The project site was near an underfunded school, and Eleanor suggested incorporating safe recreational areas into the design. The proposal was approved, and her solution became a central highlight of the redevelopment plan. She began receiving quiet praise from team leads and even local volunteers. One evening, after wrapping up a layout review, a younger architect named Zoe approached her with admiration. "Your ideas, they feel lived in," she said. "Like you're designing from memory, not just metrics." Eleanor smiled softly. She wasn't just rebuilding homes. She was rebuilding herself. A few weeks later, encouraged by Zoe and Helen, Eleanor applied for a part-time position at a boutique architecture firm known for restoring historical spaces. The office was in a modest brick building downtown, far from the imposing glass towers David used to inhabit. As she waited for the interview, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. Her posture was straighter, her clothes carefully chosen, and for the first time in months, her face bore no trace of dread. When the managing partner called her in, Eleanor spoke clearly and with conviction. Her voice didn't waver. She was no longer asking for permission to return to her field. The interview ended with a handshake and a promise to follow up. 2 days later, she received the call. The position was hers. She'd start assisting on a church restoration, initially shadowing but soon contributing directly. Eleanor accepted gratefully, feeling an unfamiliar but welcome pressure on her chest, hope. She bought a new notebook and sketched during her commute, finding inspiration in old cathedrals and civic spaces she passed. The firm's office buzzed with collaboration, and Eleanor, though older than most of her peers, felt welcome. They didn't care that she was once a housewife, they cared that she could design with soul. Back at home, Eleanor turned her dining room into a hybrid workspace, stacking reference books beside soup bowls and pasting floor plans on the walls. Her days were full, mornings on site, afternoons sketching, evenings drafting proposals for the community project. She no longer checked David's social media or tracked the progress of the divorce proceedings obsessively. Her mind was elsewhere, immersed in textures, angles, natural lighting, and community flow. Even her sleep improved, free from dreams of courtroom humiliation and replaced by mental blueprints waiting to be drawn. Occasionally, she'd run into old acquaintances who barely recognized her. One afternoon at a local cafe, she saw Carolyn, the same neighbor who had once looked through her. This time, Carolyn approached her, eyes wide. "Eleanor, you look incredible. What are you doing these days?" Eleanor responded calmly, "I'm back in architecture. Working on a historical restoration, actually." Carolyn blinked, as if unable to compute that Eleanor had moved on while the gossip hadn't. "Well, good for you," she said, tone uneven. Eleanor smiled, not in vindication, but in peace. She didn't need validation anymore. She had momentum. One morning, while organizing files in the architecture firm's break room, Eleanor overheard two colleagues discussing a high-profile renovation project. As she passed by, she saw a familiar name flash on a folder left on the counter, Davenport and Gold. It was David's financial firm. Her pulse quickened. Curious, she peeked into the folder, only briefly. It wasn't the contents that stunned her, but the contact list attached. One of the listed clients was a luxury development group, known for offshore accounts and tax loopholes. She knew that name. David had once bragged about moving investments through them for efficiency. She said nothing at first. But the detail haunted her for days. She began researching quietly, looking through public filings and court documents. As she dug, she noticed a pattern: fund transfers, unusual property holdings, sudden dips in account activity. One night, surrounded by notes and coffee cups, she realized what it was. David had begun moving assets well before the divorce began. It wasn't just selfishness. It was calculated. Her initial hurt gave way to something sharper: resolve. If he thought she would walk away without knowing the full picture, he was mistaken. It was time to build her own case. 2 weeks later, a courier mistakenly delivered an envelope to her firm's mailbox. It was meant for the office upstairs, but bore Eleanor's old address, listed as a secondary contact for David's business years ago. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside were internal statements, likely mailed in error, detailing fund movements between shell companies. They weren't marked confidential, but Eleanor knew exactly what they were. Evidence. The kind that could shift an entire courtroom dynamic if interpreted correctly. She copied the documents and resealed the envelope, personally walking it to the right recipient. That evening, she laid out all her research, printouts, annotations, digital backups. This wasn't revenge. It was justice. She would do it cleanly, methodically. No drama, no shouting. David had underestimated her. The same woman he dismissed as dull was now quietly preparing a financial dossier strong enough to challenge his entire narrative. She scheduled a meeting with her lawyer, calm and ready. "I have something I think you should see," she said, sliding the documents across the table. Her lawyer's eyes widened as he read. Eleanor didn't flinch. She wasn't done falling. She was done being silent. Eleanor's lawyer, Mr. Kaplan, was a seasoned man who had seen more than his share of bitter divorces, but as he flipped through the documents she brought, his brows furrowed in disbelief. "These are clean records of offshore asset movements," he said, voice low. "If we corroborate this with the financial timeline of your separation, we can argue willful concealment. This changes everything." Eleanor nodded, calm but focused. This wasn't just about a fair settlement anymore, it was about exposing a deeper truth David thought he had hidden behind paperwork and arrogance. For the next several days, Eleanor worked closely with Mr. Kaplan and a forensic accountant. She stayed late at the firm, comparing statements, documenting discrepancies, and carefully building a timeline that would be both legally sound and undeniably clear. Each hour she spent reviewing spreadsheets was a step toward justice. She didn't let herself get angry. Emotion would cloud the strategy. Instead, she treated it like an architectural project: structure, integrity, and foundation. David had underestimated the wrong person. She wasn't just going to fight back. She was going to dismantle the very structure he had tried to weaponize against her. One morning, Eleanor received an anonymous email from a private account. "You don't know me, but I used to work for your husband's firm. I've seen some of what he's done. If you want to talk, meet me tomorrow at Cafe Allura at 10 a.m. The message made her heart race. It could be nothing, or it could be everything. She replied with a simple confirmation and spent the evening reviewing everything again, mentally preparing for a conversation that might shift the ground beneath her feet. She didn't know who this person was, but something told her to trust her instinct. At Cafe Allura, Eleanor recognized the woman immediately. She had seen her once, years ago, during a company party David had insisted she attend, always introducing her as "my wife, the creative one." The woman introduced herself as Maya, a former junior analyst. Over coffee, Maya recounted how she had discovered unusual transactions and tried to report them internally. David dismissed her, warning that it would get complicated. Eventually, she resigned. Before leaving, she copied everything she could, just in case. "I kept it because I couldn't stand what he was doing," Maya said. "And I thought, maybe one day, someone would make it right." She handed Eleanor a USB drive and stood up quietly. "Now it's your turn." With Maya's files in hand and her financial case sharpened to a point, Eleanor felt a sense of clarity she hadn't known in years. The second court hearing loomed ahead, and while David likely expected another quiet proceeding, she had no intention of allowing him to dictate the tone. Her lawyer reviewed the new materials meticulously, strategizing the timing for introducing the evidence. "This isn't just about division of assets anymore," Kaplan said. "This is fraud. Misrepresentation. Possibly even perjury, if he denies knowledge." Eleanor nodded. She had no interest in vengeance, but she would not allow deception to define her future. The weekend before the hearing, Eleanor went for a walk through the park near the community housing project. Families gathered on benches she had designed. Children played on structures she had helped restore. It reminded her of something important: this wasn't just about winning. It was about reclaiming her narrative. About proving, above all else, that she had always been more than someone's wife. When the hearing arrived, she wore a gray suit, simple but powerful. No frills, no borrowed confidence. Just Eleanor, intact, informed, and unafraid. And when David entered the room with that same smug air, she didn't flinch. This time, she was ready. Before the hearing began, Eleanor waited in the courthouse lobby with Kaplan beside her, going over final notes. David appeared, wearing a tailored navy suit, flanked by his attorney and the same young woman who once taunted Eleanor during the first session. He spotted her, walked over, and smirked. "Still playing the victim, huh? You should have taken the initial offer. You'll be walking out of here with barely anything." His voice was calm, his words meant to rattle. But Eleanor stood still, eyes level. "If you think this is still about what you think I deserve, then you really haven't been paying attention," she said. The young woman chuckled beside him. "That's a nice suit," she said with a smirk. "Goodwill, or clearance rack?" Eleanor didn't blink. She looked between the two and replied, "Confidence doesn't come from fabric. It comes from knowing the truth." Kaplan leaned in, signaling it was time. As they turned toward the courtroom, David called after her, "Whatever you think you have, it won't hold." Eleanor didn't respond. Let him believe she was bluffing. Let him laugh now. Because the moment the evidence was presented, the courtroom would stop laughing. And David would start to understand what trembling really felt like. As proceedings began, David's lawyer launched into his argument, painting Eleanor as overly emotional, financially dependent, and incapable of long-term earning power. "She willingly left the workforce," he said. "She's seeking spousal support for a lifestyle she hasn't contributed to maintaining for years." Eleanor sat quietly, her notes in hand. Kaplan listened, waited, and when the moment came, calmly stood. "Your Honor, we have recently obtained new documentation that significantly alters the framework of this case. We request permission to present supplemental evidence." The judge agreed, curious. The opposing side looked confused. Kaplan placed a stack of documents on the judge's bench and handed copies to the defense. "The following records detail a series of offshore fund transfers made by Mr. Harper, deliberately timed ahead of the divorce filing," he said. Gasps echoed faintly around the courtroom. David's expression faltered for the first time. Eleanor looked up, her voice steady. "Your Honor, may I speak?" The judge allowed it. She stood slowly, facing the bench. "This isn't about bitterness. It's about the truth. I gave up my career to support a man who built a life on lies. And I refuse to be erased by them." David was silent. For the first time, he had no words. As Eleanor finished her statement, the courtroom fell into an eerie stillness. Even the judge paused, rereading the documents with growing interest. David shifted in his chair, his confident posture replaced with rigid discomfort. His attorney whispered something urgently, flipping through the pages with pale fingers. Kaplan remained calm, knowing the evidence spoke for itself. The judge looked up, his voice even. "These documents suggest deliberate financial concealment. If this is confirmed, Mr. Harper may be subject to legal penalties beyond the divorce proceedings." The murmurs began again. David's confidence began to disintegrate. The young woman beside him leaned over, whispering sharply. David didn't respond. His jaw was clenched, his hand gripping the side of his chair. He had walked into the courtroom expecting to humiliate Eleanor one last time, but instead, he sat exposed before the very system he once thought he could manipulate. Eleanor didn't gloat. She sat still, poised, her hands resting on her lap. She hadn't come for revenge. She had come for justice. And justice, finally, was beginning to take shape. As the judge ordered an official review of David's financial records and postponed the final verdict pending investigation, the room cleared with slow footsteps and stunned silence. Eleanor stepped into the hallway without looking back. Behind her, David's voice cracked, quietly but urgently calling his attorney's name. The man's expression was stiff as stone. No longer was David the composed strategist. His facade had broken, replaced by something far less dignified, fear. For the first time, Eleanor saw him not as the man who left her, but as a man who now had everything to lose. Outside the courthouse, David followed behind her, no longer flanked by smirks or confidence. "Eleanor," he called, his voice sharp, desperate. She turned slowly. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. She tilted her head. "Doing what?" "Speaking the truth?" He shook his head. "You're destroying me." Her eyes didn't flinch. "No, David. You did that all on your own. I'm just refusing to stay buried under it." He looked away, suddenly aware of how small he seemed. Eleanor walked past him. She didn't need him to understand. She only needed him to know she was no longer afraid. In the following weeks, the investigation confirmed Eleanor's findings. The court ruled in her favor, awarding her a fair share of the hidden assets and imposing financial penalties on David for willful non-disclosure. The final hearing was quiet. David no longer dared to speak. As the judge read the verdict, Eleanor stood without emotion, nodding once, her heart calm. It wasn't joy she felt. It was release. The woman who once stood shattered in the courtroom now stood whole. As she exited for the last time, a few people from the community housing team were waiting outside. Zoe, the young architect, clapped her hands once and smiled. "You're something else, you know that?" Another woman added, "You didn't just win, you stood up with class." Eleanor nodded, grateful but grounded. She had not fought for approval. She had fought for her name, her worth, and her dignity. And in doing so, she'd inspired others. Without realizing it, Eleanor had become an example not of survival, but of redefinition. With the divorce behind her and her reputation growing within the architectural community, Eleanor was offered a full-time position at the firm, this time as a senior consultant. Her old professor Helen sent a handwritten letter, "You've always been brilliant. But now, you're also unshakable." Eleanor framed it and placed it beside her first sketchbook. Her days were now filled with site visits, client meetings, and mentoring young designers. The house that once echoed with silence was now a space of creativity, music, and purpose. It wasn't just a home, it was hers again, shaped by her own vision. She no longer flinched at the mention of David's name, nor did she track his downfall. She didn't need to. Eleanor had risen without dragging anyone down. On quiet evenings, she sat on her balcony with tea in hand, watching the sun fade across a horizon she had once feared to face alone. Now, solitude no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like clarity. Every project she took on, every blueprint she reviewed, carried a subtle signature, resilience and structure. Her designs were stronger now, because she was. Months later, Eleanor was invited to speak at an architectural conference. As she walked onto the stage in a sleek crimson dress, the room hushed in admiration. Not because of fame, but because of presence. She spoke about rebuilding communities, but everyone knew she had rebuilt something far more intricate, herself. Among the audience, near the back of the hall, sat a man alone. David. His face unreadable, his suit wrinkled, his eyes following every word she said. She didn't flinch, didn't pause. He was just another shadow in a room full of light. After her speech, she stepped down, greeted with applause. A young woman approached her, eyes wide with admiration. "You don't know what it meant to hear you today," she said. Eleanor smiled. "We all begin again somewhere." And with that, she walked away, not toward anyone, but toward herself. Because this time, the spotlight wasn't shared. It wasn't borrowed. It was hers, and it had been waiting all along.